So let's program the other buttons. But let's also recognize that we are in the advanced class and we already have used that word function a couple of times. And it's time. It's time for us to make our own functions. So for those of you who are still learning how to program, the process of programming is you write syntax that works. And once you get working syntax, then you figure out how to make this better, more efficient, cleaner, simpler. I dare say, because I'm from Texas, we have these things called ducks that occasionally fly through the air and they land on ponds that we have.
I've heard rumor of this.
You have, yeah. I didn't know how many ducks they have.
Carnivores, right? Vicious teeth.
They do, yes, yes. And so what one observes when ducks land on a pond is ducks sort of just glide across the surface of the pond. It's a beautiful thing to see. But what's happening underneath the water is their little feet are just doing their little business, propelling them across the pond. One of our goals, now that we're going to introduce the idea of functions, is that we're going to write functions until our event handlers are really just calling functions. It'll be like little ducks gliding smoothly across the surface of the water. When we read our event handlers, we're gonna make a function that says, you know what, fix up the layers. We're gonna call a function that says, you know what, fix up the feedback. We're gonna call a function that says, you know what, fix up that debug print for us. And we're gonna move all of the syntax and code and bit into the functions. That way our event handlers, nice, clean, clear, straightforward about what our intentions are. And then inside the functions will be where we actually do all of the work. This is a stylistic goal. Is it right? Is it wrong? Those are not the correct categories. But is this a good way to go? Yes, because it's going to help you write cleaner, clearer, easier to administer, easier to debug, easier to pass off code. All right, cool. You ready, Nate?
I'm ready.
All right,
I'm a little worried that my printer doesn't have any paper in it, so I don't know that the print function is going to work. I'm following along, right? I'm doing this right? I think I got that right.
So one of the first things that we should do as we set out to plan what these functions do, we're going to make a function that takes care of the layers. We're going to make a function that takes care of the feedback, and we're going to make a function that takes care of the printing. Are there any discernible patterns to the code? Now, we could have copied and pasted and built out the other three buttons just like Nate did in his version of the class, but we're going to kind of fast forward through some of that, and we're just going to use our imagination to imagine that we copied and pasted, and we're just going to look at the code now to see the patterns of, oh, actually, as I think about the layers, every time I press one of these buttons, the first thing I do is I turn off all the layers. And then, depending on which button I pressed, I turn that layer back on. And of course, we always keep the base layer on. In our function, we want to know which button did we press. There are 3 different buttons that we could have pressed. So we're going to create a variable to hold that information, but we're also going to create 3 constants that's going to make our code easier to read. So let's do it. Let's make variables and constants. How do you do that, you ask? You do it simply by calling them into existence. And by the way, there is no difference between constants and variables in Lua. There just isn't. Constants are merely variables that you just agree to never change. It's not a different kind of thing. They're all the same kinds of things. So I'm going to create 3 constants, and I'm going to name mine with the prefix k because that's my way of saying I'm creating a constant. And I'm going to create the layer underscore room, and I'm going to assign it the value of 1. I'm going to create k layer underscore displays and assign it the value of 2, and I'm going to create K layer underscore cameras and assign it the value of 3. And then I'm going to create a variable, which I'm going to prefix with var so that I know this is a variable. I'm going to call it active layer. And by default, we are going to initialize it to be K layer room. Well, why didn't you name it active button? Well, because I've done this a time or two. And I know that in the long run, I think it being active layer instead of active button is going to make more sense to us. So we're going to call it var active layer, and we're going to initialize it like that. So let's update our event handler to actually make use of this idea. The pattern that we are actually going to follow is this. When the button is pressed, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to set the var active layer. And then we're going to call a function that will set the layers appropriately. And then we will call a function that will set the button feedback appropriately. And then we will call a function that will send some debug information to our window. So we have updated our game plan. So let's start playing that out. So down here in my event handler, line 15, I am going to, guess what? Set the var active layer to be K layer room because we pressed the btn nav room. That is the layer that we want to see. That's good. So there it is. We have done line 2, set var active layer. Line 3, call the function. Ooh, we got to write it. So let's write the function. So here's the thing. You've probably heard this forever, even if you don't know anything about computer science. You've got to define functions before you call them. Now, again, in the intermediate class, you kind of just put functions out on the canvas wherever you wanted them, and everything worked out fine, usually. Here in line code, you really do need to put functions linearly ahead, right, at lower line numbers before you ever call the function. So we intend to call the function down here in line 17, but we need to define it up here. So keyword function. We're going to give this function a name. I'm going to call it func show layer. I'm going to give it an argument list of none. It's just going to be open and close parentheses. And I'm going to hit return twice. I'm going to enter the keyword end. Because I opened a set of code, I'm going to close the chunk of code.
I'm going to double down on what Jeff just said there. You may remember if you took the intermediate class that I didn't bother to call a variable as a prefix or call the functions as a prefix. And why not? Well, because there were really obvious colors in the block controller that you know that this is a function and this is a variable and things like that. There are other ways of defining what it was. And when you're looking to pull up a list of variables, it will only pull up the variables and things like that. Here in scripting world, it's a bit more open, right? If you don't do this good housekeeping ahead of time by naming what your variables are and reminding yourself that it's a variable, by reminding yourself that a function is a function, when you get to the point where you're trying to type it in, you're going to realize that you've lost the thread and you don't know what it is you're recalling. This is good work. You should always do it when you're in line coding.
And to be fair, all right, as you get better, you'll need less. I don't really want to call them training wheels. Look, in the world historically of how do you name things, there was a whole movement for a long period of time of naming things with as few characters as possible. And there's also now a corresponding movement to the other end of the pendulum swing of name things as descriptively as possible. And I will be the first to tell you that I am naming things very descriptively. And so if it just drives you bonkers that I am calling every function, prefixing it with the word func, again, remember, this is a class. Make your own style guide and stick to your style guide. But this is meant to be useful. So func show layer, what do we want to do? All right, we said we wanted to, and I'm making little notes to myself. So in fact, we'll put it above for the moment. we want to, obviously we want to set all the layers appropriately, but setting the layers appropriately means turn off layers. And then it also means turn on the one layer that we should turn on based off of which button, which actually is based off of var active layer, right? That's what we're doing. We're using var active layer to help us know which layer to turn back on. So what do we want func show layer to do? Right, here's our plan. We want to turn everything off, and then we want to turn back on the correct layers based off of var active layer telling us which layer is supposed to be back on. Okay, well, let's give that a shot. Do we know how to turn off layers, Nate?
We make their visibility false.
You do, you got it.
Yeah.
All right, here's what we're gonna do. I am gonna come down to my event handler and highlight all of this, and I'm gonna do Control X, and then come up here and paste in. And actually, I'm going to make that say A1 false, B1 false, C1 false, and Z1 true. We're resetting the layers to the base state. We're turning off all the layers that are supposed to be off and making sure that the one layer that's supposed to always be on is on. So then we need to turn on the one layer that's supposed to be on based off of which active layer we're on. That means we're going to write one of those if-then trees.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? We saw that. That was on a slide just a few moments ago. We'll see you in the next one.